In this video, we're going to learn how you can make your own custom charcoal skulls. Today's video is sponsored by National Pork Board, and so we are grilling up some delicious looking pork tenderloins. We've got our charcoal grill going. You guys know we love grilling, and today we're doing tenderloin, and I'm really excited for it.
There are a lot of common misconceptions about pork, so we're gonna try and debunk some of that today.
One of the most well-known incorrect things about pork is that you're supposed to cook it until it's 160 Fahrenheit inside. This is actually greatly overcooking it. According to the USDA, it is safe to cook pork to an internal temperature of 145 degrees Fahrenheit. That's all you need, and you're going to get what is a surprisingly juicy and delicious, flavorful cut of meat. It's not going to be dry.
Amazing.
It's not going to be chewy. It's going to be soft and tender. Pork is actually a great source of lean protein. In a 3-ounce serving, pork loin and pork sirloin both contain 24 grams of protein. A pork tenderloin like we're cooking today has 22 grams of protein per serving.
So most people don't know that properly prepared pork tenderloin has less fat than chicken breast.
We're cooking these tenderloins over charcoal today. I love cooking on charcoal, the flavor and smokiness that it gives. And it's interesting, a few weeks ago, I saw something on the internet, a post about a Japanese artist who had managed to make charcoal briquettes in the shape of skulls. I thought that was such a cool looking thing that I set about trying to figure out how I could do that myself. And I think I've cracked a method to do it that you would be able to do too. So today, that's what we're gonna be doing. We're gonna be taking a look at how to make custom shaped charcoal briquettes. And like the artist that made them before me, I'm going to be making skull-shaped charcoal briquettes, although the same principles should apply to a lot of different shapes.
So you cook this to like perfection. So a lot of people think you need to cook this all the way through so it's like white, but you can sort of see this pink tint. That's what you want, right?
Just a little hint of pink. It doesn't need to be white on the inside and juices running clear. That is a misconception. If you've done that, you've overcooked it. You're gonna lose a lot of flavor and juiciness and tenderness to it.
Oh my gosh, that is so good.
Once again, thanks to our sponsor for today's video, National Pork Board. You can incorporate pork into a healthy diet. Just go to pork.org/cooking to learn more. Here we go. Here are some of my prototype charcoal skulls. These took me a few weeks of development to figure out. I had to get a good recipe that I thought would shape well and burn well. And of course I had to figure out how to turn them into the shape that I wanted. So I've got 5 of these right here, and I actually have a couple of different methods that we're gonna look at of how to make these charcoal skulls. These are all made in the same method, and coming up soon we'll get into some of the other methods. This right here, of course, is not made of charcoal, but this was sort of the first step in getting these skulls made. I found a 3D model of a human skull on the internet, and I printed it out to about 2 inches tall. This was pretty anatomically accurate when I got it, meaning that there were a lot of very thin spots. The jaw was a separate piece, and there was a lot of backfilling that needed to happen if I was going to try and mold and cast this same shape. So you can see I've got clay. That's these brown spots. I used clay to backfill it a little bit in a few different places where I thought the cavities were too extreme, and the white is a result of the molding that I've already done. This was printed in ABS plastic, so I also just took a paper towel with a little bit of acetone and rubbed that down. It does a really good job of smoothing out ABS plastic. The next step was to make a mold, and I thought I would use plaster. I used plaster of Paris. There are a few different varieties of plaster. Powder that you mix with water, mix it all together, and it turns into a pretty hard rock-like substance. Plaster of Paris is not the hardest or most durable of these, but it is one of the most easy to get your hands on, so that's what I used as a first test here. What I'm about to explain, it's not a 100% demonstrated step-by-step process. I'm going to describe what I've already done. This won't be a perfect instructional video. It will take a little bit of figuring out if you want to try this on your own. I actually ended up making 2 molds, both in different attempts to make the mold pieces separate out nicely. My first one I tried to do in a 2-piece mold, making it so that approximately this much of the skull would lift off as one piece, and the other side would lift off as a second piece. The second time I did it, I isolated the face even more, hoping to get some more detail. So about like that was one piece, and then I had all of the rest of it broken up into several pieces. Either way, the principle is the same. I have here some oil-based clay. I've put it in the microwave just for a couple of minutes to get it nice and warm. It makes it much more pliable. Now, I begin wrapping it around the skull. The clay is now approximately around the skull, but I want some nice clean lines, so I've just got a little sculpting tool here, and I can go in and make sure that the clay is running right up to where I want it. And then I can go in and clean up. If I've got too much clay in one spot, I can scrape it away. Not enough, obviously I can add a little bit more. This just helps me get cleaner lines going all the way around the skull. So let's say that's the exact shape. I'm trying to get that much of the skull on one piece of my mold. Just gonna build up outside parts of the clay a little bit more to give sort of a flat surface here. My goal here is to have a piece of plaster that just perfectly covers this much of the skull right here. So to pour the plaster, I'm gonna take more of this clay. Now we're gonna take a flattened piece of clay and build a wall all the way around this skull. All right. Now if you look at this the way it is now, it's kind of like a bowl with the face of a skull down at the bottom of it. Make sure that all of these edges get nice and sealed up so that no plaster could leak out. At this point, I would take some plaster of Paris and I would follow the mixing instructions, adding water to it, mixing it up, and I would pour that liquid down, covering this skull face. One trick I've learned to try and avoid getting air bubbles or missing some of the details right on the surface of what you're trying to mold is you can take your fingers, dip it into the slurry that you make when you mix up the plaster. You can actually just flick that down onto whatever you're molding. It really helps push it down into all of the tiny little crevices to make sure you don't miss any of the little details. You would pour plaster, filling up the clay. This is just to show you what you would do. Pour plaster in, and what you're going to get after it cures, you'll be able to take this clay wall off. At this point, we have what looks like the impression of a skull face pushed into the plaster. This is what we're trying to use to make our little skulls. We're then going to do pretty much the same thing again, but on the other side. I wanted to make sure that I could take all of these pieces off really easily. I didn't want to just have a two-part mold where it's one for the front and one for the back. It's going to be really hard to get all of the details but not have it break as you do that. So instead of just putting one wall and pouring it all like that, I divided it up into 4 pieces on the back. Pour the plaster in, you let it cure, and at that point you're able to take the clay off and start working on the next quadrant. Just continue around doing one of the 4 pieces at a time until you've got the whole thing covered in plaster. Once you've got all of the pieces cast, this is about what you're going to end up with. It's a block made out of several smaller blocks. At this point, you're ready to demold your skull or whatever shape you're trying to do this with. That piece comes off, these 4 pieces separate, and the skull is free. With the molds made, it's time to move on to how to make your own charcoal briquette material. Commercial charcoal briquettes are made of several different things. Some of it's actually wood charcoal, wood that's been burned in a low oxygen environment to turn into a charcoal dust. If you're buying lump charcoal, these things that just look like blackened pieces of wood, that's basically all of the steps. It's burned in a low oxygen environment, it's pyrolyzed and turns into charcoal. Briquettes, however, are a different matter and they have a little bit more involved in them. Commercial charcoal briquettes will have a few more ingredients. They'll usually have some charcoal, some coal that's been ground into a dust, lime as an additive to make it so you can see when the charcoal is properly burning, and at least one type of binding agent. This right here is garden lime. It's something that you mix into your soil and it changes the pH and it can help your flowers look a little bit different. It comes in this rough pellet or small granule formula. We want this as a dust, so I actually just took some of this and I ran it through a blender. It blended up quite nicely and just turned into a fine powder. And this right here is what we're using as a binding agent. While doing some research, I found that tapioca flour is supposed to be very sticky and work as a binding agent quite well. Those are our 3 main ingredients. That's what we're going to be making these skulls out of. We've got charcoal dust, garden lime, and gluten-free flour. We'll also use a little bit of cornstarch mixed with charcoal dust as a mold release, something to make our paste stick a little bit less to the plaster as we're pressing it in there. We've got a little bit of charcoal dust. We want to make more than just what we have in this bag, so let's whip up a new batch. And for that, we're using a powerful blender and some of our lump charcoal. This is loud and it's messy. Blender full of charcoal, here goes. Very quickly fills with enough charcoal dust that you can't see what's going on inside. You're just gonna have to keep blending it, keep shaking it a little bit until you don't hear any more big pieces in there. We're gonna let that settle for a little bit so we don't have a huge plume of charcoal floating out when we open the lid. But let's move on to the next step, and that's preparing our flour. The stove isn't turned on yet. This is just flour in a pot, and I'm just gonna add water a little bit at a time until I have a pretty thin consistency. I'm not trying to make a paste just by adding the water. I'm trying to have it be pretty runny and then turn it into a paste by cooking it. And by mixing it in before it's hot, the water does a much better job of really enveloping and getting all of the flour to mix in really nice and evenly. We don't want too many lumps before we start cooking. I've found that you really do want to keep stirring it the whole time, otherwise the stuff at the bottom of the pot is just gonna sort of firm up and turn to almost a gelatin while the stuff at the top is still liquid. And we wanna keep the consistency as uniform as possible. Okay, we're gonna call that good. You can see how much this is thickened up from the heavy cream consistency it was at before. Now here's the approximate recipe I'm gonna go with. I'm gonna start with about 1 of these spoonfuls of our cooked gluten-free flour. And then we're gonna add a couple of these same spoonfuls of water. We'll end up adding more water later, but this is just to help dissolve what we've got here into a smoother consistency that helps with mixing it up later. Now we're adding about 1 of these spoonfuls of our ground up lime. This particular lime, this is garden lime, so it has additives in it, but it's mostly calcium carbonate. And the important thing with calcium carbonate is that it doesn't burn when we put it in the fire. It's a pretty low quantity and it gets completely masked by the charcoal when it's dry and not burning. But when it starts burning, that white really gets highlighted and we can see it on the outside of our briquettes. It's the same thing that's used in commercial briquettes. The idea is that you can see really nicely once your charcoal briquettes are burning hot enough that you can start cooking on them. Once they're all white, you know that all of the charcoal is burning and so you're ready to go. I'm just gonna take a sieve, put it in our bag. We're gonna pour everything into that. All of the dust will fall through, all of the big stuff, we can just run through the blender more. All right, we've got a decent amount of charcoal dust now. We're going to add about 10 of these spoonfuls of the charcoal into the mixture that we've got. And now we're just gonna mix it all up. We started with that sort of sludge of our flour that had been cooked in a little bit of water. And this is mixing together, however, it's so dry that we would have a really hard time getting it to stick together. We need more water just to get it to a very, very thick and dry paste. This is just not quite dry enough. I don't think it's just gonna be a little bit crumbly. So we just want a little bit more water, not a ton. Let's try just 1 more spoonful and see where we get. We should be able to just grab some of our powder in here, squeeze it together in our fingers and have it stick together in a lump. And I think we're getting that point. I think we're there. So we can just squeeze that and we can see that it stays together in the shape we want. That's just what we're looking for. Here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna put these 4 pieces, we're gonna hold these together with a couple of rubber bands with our coating on there. Now we're gonna start taking our charcoal, we're gonna start filling both sides of the mold. Just gonna press that down in there, squish it down with my finger, add a little bit more. Right near the surface, I've pressed it down much less. I pressed it just enough that it's sticking, but I compacted it a lot more farther down in the skull, and that's because where the 2 sides meet, I don't want it pressed all the way. I want there to be a little bit of give to it so I can sort of push them together and have it adhere one side to the other. And just to try and make sure that it sticks pretty well, I'm gonna add a couple of drops of water. Not much, just a little bit. Press that down on. Look at that. We've got the face of a skull already showing up. A little bit of extra powder on the sides in some spots, but I'm liking the look. All right, I take the rubber bands off and these pieces just start to fall apart. And that is why I made the mold the way I did, is to make it so it's really easy to get these out. But look at that, we have a little skull made of charcoal. Now, of course, this still has water in it. It has too much water to burn it at this point. So what we want to do is let this sit out for a day or 2 to really dry out entirely. If you have a dehydrator, you can throw in the dehydrator and it'll probably be ready to go in about 2 or 3 hours rather than a day or 2. Got some slightly different skulls here. Now these ones look different because I did not make the mold for these. They were made with a similar but slightly different process. Rather than making this paste, I added enough water that it actually turned into a liquid. I blended that liquid to get it nice and smooth, and then I poured these into an ice cube mold. Then I stuck the whole thing in the freezer, and once they were frozen solid, I took them out of the mold and I put them in our freeze dryer. That's a machine that gets really, really cold, pulls a vacuum around everything that's inside it, and then as it heats up, all of the frozen water sublimates, turning directly into a gas without hitting the liquid stage, and just gets pulled right out of whatever's in there. They're a little bit lighter weight and they're a little bit more fragile actually than our other skulls, but it is pretty cool how you can get really clear definition. Now, one last experiment I did was to take our same binding agent made of flour, but instead of using the lime and the charcoal, I went ahead and added thermite. That's a mixture of aluminum and iron oxide, and so I made a paste out of the thermite and I pressed those into a couple of molds as well. I let them dry. These actually took several days to dry because they're a lot more dense. The thermite powder, it's a metal powder, and so I really had to let all of the moisture out of these before they were dried completely. But I think at this point what we need to do is test out how well these charcoal briquettes burn. Charcoal is usually something that you want to give a few minutes of good prolonged heat. That's one of the reasons you use lighter fluid. Just keep the heat on there, but I'm trying with a blowtorch to get a little bit more concentrated and controlling the direction of the heat. Custom making individual charcoal briquettes may not be the best method for your barbecue, but as a few pieces just to stand out, they do look really cool while they burn. I've got my thermite skull with a little bit of fuse in it. We're gonna light that off and see how this does. Fuse didn't work, so I drilled out the top of the skull just a little bit. Now we're using a sparkler. We're gonna see if this will set it off. Give us a nice long countdown. Whew. Oh my gosh, that's a lot of heat pouring off of that. Hey guys, if you haven't signed up yet, our Random Hacks subscription box is live and ready to ship to your house. We'll send you a box every month with a different King of Random project that you can do yourself. Click that box down there to check it out, and we'll see you there.